is Dinah Winnick. I'm Acting Director of Communications in UMBC's Office of Institutional Advancement, and I'm here today with public historian Denise Meringlo to talk about a course funded by Breaking Ground, which is essentially a community conversation about creating projects that can have a real tangible, lasting impact through the UMBC community. So Denise, could you introduce yourself?
Sure, I'm Denise Meringlo, and I'm Associate Professor of History and Director of our Public History track here at UMBC.
And what for the non-historians is public history?
I would like to start with what public history is not. And public history is not just an act of translation, so it's not just historians telling their story to a different audience. And it's not just history plus, like it's not just the study of history with additional skills added, but instead public history is really an expression of public service. And I'm training students to really think about how the tools of history can be put to use not simply for a community, but with them and embedded in their needs. So that's what public history is.
And the work you're doing here at Baltimore is very exciting, and I was wondering if you could sort of give a brief overview of it and sort of how it got started.
Sure. So when I first came to UMBC to teach public history, I realized that my students weren't going to learn as much if I just kept them in an artificial environment in the classroom and kind of gave them made-up projects to work on or had them reading about public history. So I immediately knew that I wanted to be working with and for local organizations or local communities. And it was really a learning process for me, so that when I got here, I did some work with some local historical organizations, and they made up projects that weren't real, so that didn't quite work. Or then I went into a community that I saw as having a historical need, and I wanted my students to build relationships, but that was a little too much to accomplish in one semester. And so after some time, I finally met the staff of Baltimore Heritage, which is a local preservation advocacy organization. And I got to know their goals. I got to know what they wanted to have happen in Baltimore. They were very engaged at the time in building content to talk about the downtown's West Side neighborhood. And so before I did any work with my students, I really understood what Baltimore Heritage wanted. And so then together, we designed a class where my students were building content about the historic structures and resources in this neighborhood of Baltimore. And it's been a really remarkable partnership to kind of get my students thinking about what is the role of history in turning a downtown kind of abandoned neighborhood back into a place.
Mm-hmm. And collaboration is often sort of very messy work, so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about some of the challenges and hiccups along the way and sort of figuring out who had what roles and how you were moving forward with it.
Yeah, so this project was really useful to me in the classroom because it was well defined. So I knew that Baltimore Heritage wanted historical content. They had buildings identified that they wanted the city to consider as part of revitalization. They wanted to make an argument that they should be saving and reusing historic structures and not tearing down and rebuilding entire neighborhoods. And so it started out pretty simply, that my students were going to do research on individual structures and that Baltimore Heritage was going to kind of use them in the development of this app, so that when you're walking through the neighborhood now, you kind of go to explore Baltimore Heritage. You can download the app for your iPhone and explore those buildings. So the first learning curve for me as a public historian was that Baltimore Heritage is a preservation entity, so they wanted to know about individual buildings. And I am a social and cultural historian, and my students were invested in the idea of people. And so we kind of had a little bit of a learning curve to figure out how we could design content that would connect structures, put people back in those places, and invite new audiences to come back into the West Side while still meeting kind of the interests of Baltimore Heritage. And the first class that we did together, which was actually before Breaking Ground, I think my students, if I'm honest, were a little bit disappointed because they designed tours that were very thematically driven And then Baltimore Heritage went back and sort of rebuilt the content a little bit so that it was very sort of structure oriented. But what was fantastic was that we really learned from each other, so that my students and I could kind of articulate to Baltimore Heritage what is really the value of telling a story about this place, not just recounting sort of the dates and names that happened there. And then Baltimore Heritage could explain to us why it was important to focus a little bit more on the architecture. So the learning curve between us was really valuable, and in the end, I thought that they were really disappointed in us, but they were happy that they had learned a new thing about what public history is, as opposed to kind of the language of preservation or sort of architectural history in and of itself. So that was empowering, I think, for both of us.
So it sounds like you really sort of grew and evolved together throughout the whole process.
And I'm comfortable with that, and because I came out of a museum environment. I think for my students, for whom this kind of civically engaged learning was new, it was a little daunting to figure out how to perform in a classroom for me, but really be more invested in the product and working with our partners. And so that's every semester kind of a new experience for my students that's really valuable.
And what do you think they took away from this experience of sort of ending the semester and having a tangible piece of public history that they worked on?
Well, a few things. So the first semester, they built the content for the app, and then one of the students from the class then interned with Baltimore Heritage over the summers, because I thought continuity and a commitment to one another was really important. And so those students, not only are they able to point to the content they have on the web and or on their smartphones and show people what they've done. They've got a portfolio of work that matters, but really more importantly, they've become really concerned about the city and aware of what's happening in the city, and they're sending me links about what's happening in these neighborhoods, and that makes me feel like the learning has continued beyond the classroom, that they really were empowered to take it on as their own. And then the really powerful thing is that the Breaking Ground course built on this relationship, and several of the students from the original experiment came into the second class and learned how to do digital storytelling as a way to put different kind of content into that app. So I think what's really important is not only that they have a history of work, they have a portfolio that they can show to people, but they have learned how to become committed to a project over the long haul, even if they sort of felt like the first go-around wasn't what they expected. I won't say they thought it was a failure, but the outcome wasn't what they expected, and they've come gradually to embrace that as part of their learning experience.
And given all of the innate challenges to doing any kind of work of this nature that, you know, is real and on the ground, and solving a public challenge out in the open in real time, what would you say to a faculty member who's just sort of getting started?
Well, I think the lessons that I have learned are several. One is that you can't bring a class of students into a project cold and expect them to sort of build the relationships and do the work and sort of figure out, it doesn't work for me. It might work in other cases. It makes it really difficult to manage. The second thing is that it's really important that there's a continuing relationship, at least with the instructor and the institution. The students will change every semester, but there has to be a sense of trust built on both sides. The third thing is that I think that we all struggle a little bit as professors with being control freaks, and the way that I have found to direct my control freak behavior is to do a lot of planning up front about what the project's goals are. And so once the class starts, I let go of a lot of that control, but I personally need to know from the outset, all right, what are we aiming for? You know, how can I break that down into manageable bits? And I do a lot of work negotiating with my external partners about what's reasonable to accomplish in a semester. You know, we have a long-term goal, but let's break this into one sort of set of learning goals for the semester, and then we can continue after the semester. So I think that's really important to kind of figure out where to put your energy in terms of planning and where you're willing to let go in the classroom to your own authority and kind of let students take their responsibility for their own learning. Yeah. It's very challenging, but it's important.
And what are next steps for this project or for related work in Baltimore?
So I'm continuing working with Baltimore Heritage this semester. Our first project was all around downtown's west side, and this semester we're working on tours for Druid Hill, which is I'm learning so much about Druid Hill I did not know. It's one of the oldest urban parks in the country. It's the biggest urban park in the country. And so my students are developing tours that will be part of the Explore Baltimore Heritage app that are theme-driven. The staff at Baltimore Heritage and I kind of revamped the way the project worked in the past so that there's a little bit more control up front about the themes that Baltimore Heritage wants to have happen, and students are kind of now working within that to develop stories around specific sites in the park. What I'm finding really interesting this particular semester is that I have students who are new to the city, I have students who grew up in the city, I have students who grew up nearby, and they have all had very different reactions to the park. Some of them had never been there, even though they've lived there their whole lives. Some of them go there all the time. And so that's really become part of the conversation, and they're sort of understanding themselves both as producers of content, but also as active citizens in the city. And that's really informing the kind of content that they're developing and what they want people to get out of it, that they want the city to be a place that feels familiar to people, that has stories that they can connect with and that they're encouraged to use as citizens. So that's where we're going right now, and the new content hopefully will be up this summer.
That sounds great, and I would definitely encourage all of the viewers to check out the Baltimore Heritage app and also go onto breakingground.umbc.edu to learn more about your project.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks, Denise.
Thanks very much.